Welcome to Global Perspectives. What are the best education options for internationally mobile young people? Rebecca Grappo, an international consultant, has multiple answers.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Thank you.
So, before we get into the nuts and bolts of working with internationally mobile young people, tell us how you got into this field of work. What happened before?
Well, everything in my life led up to this point in a way. I think I should also tip my hat to my parents, who were always interested in traveling, and my mother, who was an Orange County school teacher, would work over the summers to earn extra money so that we could go on trips. And that sparked my interest, and then when I was a teenager, I was an exchange student through AFS to Italy. Then I came back and said, I think I want to do something international in my undergraduate years. And for my junior year, I spent that abroad in Luxembourg, which was a great experience, and I was really exposed to the politics and economics and social history of Western Europe. Then after graduation, I moved to Washington, D.C., had a job doing something with international trade. After Gary, my husband, and I got married, then we started moving around the world, and eventually I went back to school and got my graduate degree in education. From there, I taught in American International Schools, then Virginia Public School, then I worked for the State Department as the Education and Youth Officer, helping foreign service families to figure out how to move their kids around the world. And when he was appointed ambassador to Oman in 2006, I said, lots of people need this kind of help, and that's when I started my own private practice. So it was one of those things where every little thing in my life I was able to string together like a strand of pearls until now I have this incredible opportunity to work with kids around the world. So
I'm almost dizzy from listening to all of those in rapid succession, but fascinating. And you mentioned that your first international experience was in Italy. What was the main benefit that you took away from that experience?
Down to one.
I'm sure there were many, but if you could just maybe highlight one.
I think the one, probably the relationships and the ability to enter into another family. I went back almost exactly a year ago for the first time in over 30 years, and to see that family that still treated me as family, embraced me as family, and literally hugged and cried and kissed me as family was a really pretty incredible experience. That's probably my biggest takeaway.
Wow, so that was, you forged an international relationship at the personal level that endured all of this time.
Absolutely.
So to get back to the internationally mobile young people of today, what are some examples of people you've worked with, and maybe the children of diplomats to start with, and what do you recommend to them when they look at education options?
Well, the students that I've worked with for many, many years are the students who are living in a culture that is not their parents'. So for many in an international school, for example, or an American international school, they might be from one culture or country or passport, or have multiple passports within their family, and choose an American education. Of course, this could be a French school or a British school overseas as well. There are lots of variations on the theme. But these are the kids that come together from a variety of backgrounds, selecting one particular curriculum that they're going to be studying and going to school every day. But the beauty of that kind of environment is that you might have students from 40 or 50 different countries who come together every single day and get down to the business of learning and playing together and being friends together and going through the typical drama of a classroom together. But they grow up in a way where they're not thinking so much about their national or cultural or religious differences. So it's really this beautiful blend when it works. It's the beautiful blend of what really we want the world to be. So those are the kinds of students that I've started working with over 20 years ago and really form the bulk of our practice today.
What do you do, or how do you handle young people who are either going someplace because they have to, or because they've been encouraged to go there and they really don't want to. They have some kind of fear or concern about what it's going to be like because it's so culturally different or something like that. What do you share with them? And have you encountered that situation yourself where you were not 100% enthusiastic initially with a particular assignment?
Absolutely. Even I have not been always enthusiastic about a particular assignment in the beginning, but then I think attitude matters a lot. So having the right attitude, education, so learning as much as you can about the destination, and then a real effort to get to know what's good about the destination where you're going. So in working with kids, and I've been working with kids, like I said, for over 20 years, who are in this type of lifestyle, we see some kids who absolutely thrive in the lifestyle. They love the chance to see and do new things and have new adventures and meet and form friendships in new places. And then sometimes they might have done really well in the last school, but the new school presents different kinds of challenges. So we can't always predict how well someone is going to react. But there are times when we have to really be vigilant, and we work with this as well, and sometimes we have to be vigilant that there are some students that might really be triggered. So the event of an international relocation might actually trigger something much more serious, and so we have to be paying attention to that too, and remaining empathetic and not just always giving them a cheerleading speech about, oh, you can do it, it'll be great. The very wise Ruth Van Reken, who wrote the book Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among the Worlds, has become a very good friend of mine, and I think of her all the time in the wisdom in her book. And one of the things that she says is that it's very important for us to offer consolation before we offer encouragement. So in the work that I've done with parents, a lot of times I'll encourage them, you need to listen and validate the child's feelings or the adolescent's feelings about how difficult a move can be. And then we can work on finding ways to rebuild their lives.
You said you personally had some questions about an upcoming assignment. Could you give an example? Is there one that you would like to talk about?
Sure. Probably the biggest was when my husband joined the Foreign Service and I had some resistance to the idea of serving in the Middle East. So I told him, if you join, I'll do this, but I am not going to the Middle East. So he was maybe 8 years into his career when he called me one day and said, hey, how would you like to go to the Middle East? And I thought, what part of that did you not understand? But what I really did have a lot of trepidation about going into that part of the world. I was very afraid. I thought that my rights as a woman might be restricted, that I wouldn't be able to drive, I might have to change the way I dress, that it would be physically ugly, that the people would be unwelcoming. I mean, I had all kinds of fears and misperceptions about that part of the world. But I'm happy to say that 20 years later, after I'd have to sit and count probably 4 or 5 different assignments throughout the Middle East, and just thousands of interactions between my students and our friends and the people we worked with, the people who became adopted family. Now I'm diametrically opposite in my attitude, and that is that I absolutely love that part of the world, and I treasure the relationships and the experiences that I had. So I'm lucky. I consider myself, it was a blessing that I was able to have that experience because it completely changed my worldview.
I'm wondering if most people, including some of our viewers today, really understand the importance of having that education in another place and how that plants the seed potentially for more positive relations between your country and another country longer term after the graduate of that program goes on to rise in his or her career and perhaps has international connections. Could you address that question?
I think about not only my own children, but the students that I've worked with over the years. And what I really love about what I get to do is that by working with these students who have this opportunity to live in other parts of the world, experience different cultures, have that interaction on a daily basis, they really do have a different perspective about the world. And I would say, really it's a 3-dimensional perspective. So when they hear about something that happens in the news, they are really able to think about it and conceptualize it in a different way from the person who has never left their small community. To give you an example, I mean, I could think of hundreds of examples, but one that's fresh on my mind today is a friend of mine who is a few years younger than I am, but she's a professional woman in the Gulf. And I won't say anything more about where she works because that's not as important, is the fact that she has been following what's happening here in the United States on a daily basis. And I look to her posts on Facebook, for example, with great interest because I know that she is a reader and a thinker and that she's paying attention. She studied in the United States, and so now she has a leadership role overseas, and we have a personal friendship. But I know that that experience of her having lived and studied in a country that is not her own has given her this ability to be like a cultural chameleon. She most definitely is a member of her own country and culture, and yet she's able to have perspective on what's happening in a country that's not her own. So I think that's the beauty. This goes in a lot of different ways, not just bilateral, but multilaterally as well, as people travel around the world and have these experiences.
I've also noticed that when I travel around the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Taiwan or some other place, you frequently run into individuals who are part of the staff of the host organization or even working for the government who have degrees from U.S. academic institutions. And that's always a pleasant surprise. It gives you something to talk about, but I think more importantly, it helps those individuals understand much better the relationship between the two countries than they might otherwise be able to.
Absolutely, yeah. When the people that we have met at the government level in senior government positions around the Middle East, for example, many of them have studied in the United States and have American degrees. And while that doesn't make them American in their culture or necessarily their outlook, it certainly gives them a perspective and an ability to understand another point of view. And that really helps us, I think, in our bilateral relationships. And by the same token, when we have American students, they have the opportunity to go and study in another part of the world and see something from a different perspective and go outside of their comfort zone and be challenged, maybe be challenged with their assumptions and their perceptions about the world as it is. When they come back, they are forever changed. And I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who, I will paraphrase, said, you know, a mind that has been expanded never goes back to its original dimensions. And that's a poor paraphrase. I apologize to him. But the idea is there. You're never the same again, but that's a good thing. In that you have expanded your perspective and the world is now a multi-dimensional place instead of one-dimensional.
Talk to us about the impact of culture. They always say that culture is one of the most powerful forces in the world and very difficult to change, but there are some opportunities for change within cultures and specifically how cultures affect each other. Oftentimes you think, you know, American influence, pick your favorite country, seems to be so powerful. And yet culture works both ways.
Right. Well, I think when we first think of culture, or we think, oh, maybe we'll do an international night or a multicultural day, the first thing we think about is food and music, dance, art. But I think culture goes so much more deep than that. I think also that those who have had the experience of traveling, working, studying abroad, living abroad, have what we might call the pyramid view of culture or the iceberg model of culture, and that if you were to look at an iceberg floating in the ocean and you could see what's above the ocean and what's below the ocean, what's above the ocean is very small in proportion to what's below the ocean. And so really what we see on the outside is above the ocean, but what goes inside, it runs much deeper, and that might be harder for us to understand culturally. So when I think about culture, I also think about people's attitudes, their beliefs, their relationships, the way they approach relationships, the way they might approach life, the way they might approach religion and faith, the role of faith in civil society and family life. And language, of course, shapes the way we express our culture. So one of the benefits, I think, of learning a foreign language is that after a while your mind starts to retrain that you are thinking thoughts in that other language as well, which helps you to enter into someone else's point of view and their way of thinking. So culture is complicated. I mean, that could be a whole hour show here, but I definitely think that as we explore the world, our own culture then shifts a little bit, and that we open up a little bit to let other influences come in. Actually, part of the definition of a third culture kid, which is the child who moves around the world, I won't go into the whole definition, but that they adopt elements of every culture that they've been exposed to, and yet they don't have full ownership in any. And their sense of identity and belonging really is with people who have had similar experiences in the world. So when we think about kids, they gravitate towards other kids who have had an experience similar to theirs. And I was just in a classroom recently where as I found out who the students in the classroom were, I figured out that the 3 third culture kids who had grown up overseas were all sitting together, which I thought, well, of course you are. But also I think that adults who've had these experiences often also gravitate towards those who've experienced the world and have a greater perspective.
I really hear what you're saying. It resonates with me because I was a third culture kid. But upon returning to the United States, this was many years ago, there wasn't the kind reception to having multicultural skills, language ability, and so forth. But it started to change, and at least at the time, in the public schools, you had some that offered foreign language training relatively early. In my case, it started in the 3rd grade. And so I guess my question is, how important is the foreign language piece? And how early should you start? Is there any time that's too early, or should we start maybe even before grade school, maybe preschool?
Well, there's been more and more research lately on bilingual children. So children who were raised with both languages. In the world of expat living in international schools, it's not at all uncommon to find that a child has a parent from one nationality or culture and another parent from another, and that they find a common language to have in the home, or maybe one language will be dominant, but yet the children are being raised bilingually. That's the easiest way for us to absorb language. When our brains, the younger we are, the more plastic our brains are, and the easier it is for us to learn. So if we look at Europe, for example, or even the Middle East, you would be amazed at how many young people in the Middle East are absolutely fluent in English. And that's because they start at such a very, very early age. So what I wish we could do more of in the United States is I wish we would have foreign language immersion at an earlier age, or even just instruction to give exposure to the language, to the pronunciation, to your ear, and then even just the idea that other people are out there who aren't exactly like you, and embrace it instead of being afraid of it. The earlier we start, the earlier it is, and I think it's just critically important that we not only speak that language, but speak it for a reason, and that is that we want to communicate with other people, meet them on their terms.
I've looked at some experimental programs in schools here where they try offering the foreign language training early. And one thing that seems to win over the critics is when you don't teach the foreign language as a foreign language, but you teach it as part of the curriculum. So you're learning science or whatever the issue is in the foreign language. And I've seen kids in environments where they're learning, in addition to English, 2 other foreign languages. And by design, one is from a European country and one is from an entirely different region. And what tends to happen is the young people graduate, they start in very early in elementary school, and by the time they finish the 6th grade, they are fluent for their level of education in all 3. And there are no problems that typically emerge along the way.
I can see where that would work really well. I mean, the educator in me is thinking, well, there are always some kids for whom this is not going to be easy. Some kids have language-based learning disabilities that are going to make it more difficult for them. But on the, in general, when we're thinking about the general population, that's a great idea. And I think about how I learned Italian. When I went to my foreign exchange program, I went to a village where nobody spoke English, and it was complete immersion, total immersion. And I walked around with my little dictionaries all the time, but really the way I learned was in daily conversation and just decoding, figuring it out. I can remember distinctly my host sister standing there saying, "Dammi un piatto," and I was standing next to a stack of plates, and she had her hand out, and when I gave her the plate, she went away. And I rehearsed it in my mind. Dame must mean give me, un piatto must mean a plate, because she took it and left. So learning in context like that sometimes makes it so much easier, because it wasn't a lesson where I learned how to conjugate the verb dare and the going into the whole sentence structure. It was in context, and that's how we learned at our mother's knee. Really, that's how we acquire language. So yeah, I can see where that could work. That's not my area of expertise. I've never taught in a bilingual classroom, but certainly I can see the benefits of it.
Oh, it makes sense. Are there any places that you have not yet visited that you might have some reservations about, but in the interest of furthering the goals that you've been talking about for the past while, you would go to just to have the experience, just to learn, to have the cultural connection, to inform yourself a bit about the history and so forth?
Well, first of all, the more I travel, the more I realize I really haven't been anywhere. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know that much. So I think of all the places that I've been, I've really only scratched the surface of what this incredible world has to offer. Secondly, where would I not want to go? I honestly really don't want to go to a war zone right now. I think most people would agree. So that would be off my list, although I will say that I have been to war zones before they were war zones. Unfortunately, things haven't remained stable. But in terms of a culture that I'm afraid of now, no, there's nothing I think that I'm afraid of. And one other benefit I think of having moved and transitioned around the world as many times as I have is that I've overcome a lot, and so now I have a lot of confidence that I can do it, and I'm not as easily intimidated.
You've mentioned other people's books, and you've done a fair amount of writing on your own. I'm hearing these anecdotes, and I'm thinking, maybe there's a book in the works here. Is that the case? Potentially?
I better not show this tape to a friend of mine who has been after me for years to write the book. I do have the table of contents. She just wrote me a month ago saying, "When are you going to do it?" So it's an idea. I just need time, that's all.
And would that mean more time to travel and learn more than you already know about the world, or just time to write it, or a combination?
I need time to write. I need time to write.
So when you wake up in the morning, is your first thought, I need to go out and influence another young person and help him or her make the right decision about education opportunities as he or she travels around the world? Or is there something else that you think about first that puts you in the frame of mind to do that kind of advising?
Well, unfortunately, I'm one of these junkies who reaches for my iPhone first thing in the morning. So the first thing in the morning I do is I scroll through the emails that have come in to see what my priorities of the day are going to be. And they're usually either, I love when I can check and go delete, 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 delete. But what's left are either a student or a parent. And those are the people that I get back to right away, or whatever's on my schedule. So I don't think, I'm going to go save the world today. But I do think, okay, this is the pressing issue for this particular child today. Their parent is worried about this. This is the problem we have to solve today. And that kind of drives it. But what's fun is that I might start my day in, for example, India might be the first call of the day. And then I'll gradually be moving west, and then the midday I'm working in Europe, and then as I move further west I'm in the western part of the US, and then I might even end the day with another call to Asia or Australia late in the afternoon. So it's pretty cool. I actually love it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca Rappo.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. and we'll see you next time.